All right, welcome to the afternoon session today. We have another great panel, and this time we'll be talking about another basic fundamental attitude that is described by Dietrich von Hildebrand, faithfulness. And our panelists are Elizabeth Shaw and Hrvoje Vargic and Martin Cajthaml.
Thank you very much, Mark. Okay, I'm supposed to start, so it'll be me to start. I would very much like to speak freely as my colleagues in the morning, but since the English is not really my mother tongue, I did some preparation. I will try not to read the whole thing, but from time to time, I read a little bit. So we are talking about the other fundamental moral attitude, which von Hildebrand calls faithfulness. Normally, we think of faithfulness as one's fidelity to a spouse, to a friend, to a cause, etc. In The Art of Living, von Hildebrand uses the term in broader and more basic sense. The original title of this tiny and arguably the most popular book of von Hildebrand was Sittliche Grundhaltungen, which reads in English Fundamental Moral Attitudes. That has been already said. That was the first title of the book originally. Now it's being published as The Art of Living. And in fact, also faithfulness, besides reverence, responsibility, and some others, is understood in this book as such a fundamental or basic moral attitude. And we had in the introduction of Mark very nice explanation what attitudes in von Hildebrand are, so we can build up on that. But I would still like to make a further distinction, which was not mentioned by Mark, and that is the distinction von Hildebrand makes between moral attitudes and moral stances. Von Hildebrand, in some of his writings, distinguishes between these two. And he says he understands moral stances as factual stances toward moral sphere, which precede explicit moral consciousness. And we already heard about moral consciousness also. So these stances precede moral consciousness, and they are compounded of various outgrowths of concupiscence and pride, but also of a value-seeking and value-responding attitude. However, the value-responding attitudes present in basic stances lack a full and explicit sanction by the moral agent. Now, unlike these basic stances, which characterize the morally not fully conscious person, basic moral attitudes are fully conscious and freely taken positionings, we might say, toward the moral sphere. Basic moral attitude is therefore a full bearer of moral value and disvalue. It is, in fact, the backbone, as it were, of all more focused and transient attitudes that was also mentioned by Mark. Then in von Hildebrand, we don't only have attitudes we are taking in a particular situation to someone or to something, but we have these underlying, lasting, superactual, as he calls them, moral attitudes. And these attitudes, as has been said, pervade, and shape our actual consciousness and our conscious experiences. So reverence is one of these fundamental moral attitudes. And it is, unlike reverence, which, as we heard, is the attitude which opens our mind to the reality of values, and for this reason, it is the condition of all moral values and of all value responses. Faithfulness, unlike reverence, is both the condition for sustaining our value responses throughout our lives, and for this reason, it is a condition of our personal integrity. So we could say reverence opens our spiritual eyes, or opens our mind to values, and faithfulness is that which allows us to sustain our value responses, so that they really are, they really last. They pervade our conscious life. Traditionally, some accounts of personal identity are based on the capacity of a person to remember her past deeds and mental states, and to make them, in this way, her own. Also, von Hildebrand mentions memory as crucial for the realization of what he calls, I quote, the super-actual life of our soul, end quote. However, unlike many of these accounts, the traditional accounts or modern accounts, he highlights and analyzes in considerable detail the basic moral attitudes of a person, which are, from the moral point of view, perhaps even more important for the constitution of our personal selves than just the memory of the past. Without the capacity to sustain our value-responding attitudes through not just the flow of our changing conscious experiences, but also through the changes of fortune, the vicissitudes of our lives, we wouldn't be able to remain the same persons, and in fact, as Hildebrand says, the same personalities as we were before. Von Hildebrand says, only persons who have the capacity to remain the same over time can be called personalities. The others who do not have this capacity or do not have this fundamental attitude are, like he says, sieves through which everything runs, he adds. And we may say, with words of someone else, we could say, they do not have a strong foundation when the winds of changes shift. You might recall the words of this famous song, which also very well describes this failing attitude. Note in particular that von Hildebrand is not just a philosopher who thought a lot about this deeper and morally crucial stratum of our personal life. He is in fact a personality who himself radiated this faithfulness with an unusual and admirable vigor. Think only about the intellectual integrity of his whole work. Think about his faithfulness to the just cause he fought for during the Nazi time in Germany. It seems to me, therefore, and I think Peter Kraft mentions that in the introduction to this book, that the following description of the faithful man in von Hildebrand is an apt description of Hildebrand himself. So actually the virtues he describes fit very well on himself, and it is very clear in case of faithfulness. Let me read this short quote. Hildebrand writes, such men, describing faithfulness, are consequently protected from the tyranny of fashion. A thing never makes a deep impression upon them merely because it is modern, because it is momentarily in the air, but only because it has a value, because it is beautiful, good, and true, end quote. Now, one may ask whether this attitude of faithfulness to the truth and value von Hildebrand speaks about in The Art of Living is not a hindrance to the readiness to change he describes in the transformation in Christ, and which was already mentioned. So one might ask himself the question, or herself the question, is it possible that the ability not to change and the readiness to change can harmoniously coexist in the deeper strata of one and the same human person? And I think this point was already mentioned by Jim in the introduction, so I want to come back to that. And I think basically this question is just a rhetorical question. It doesn't really point to any inconsistency in von Hildebrand's thought, but it might be useful just to see more in detail that, in fact, these two things can coexist very well together, and in fact, one is the condition of the other. So if you look into the transformation of Christ, these are pages more or less 38 to 40 in the reader. Von Hildebrand says there, he talks about the readiness to change, and he says the first thing which is important is that this readiness to change, although it must be radical, unqualified, and unlimited, it is still radically opposed to spineless malleability. And he says, the fluidity which goes with aliveness to the supernatural has nothing to do with spineless malleability as such. Rather, it involves a firm standing in the face of all mundane influences, a character of impermeability in regard to them, and an unshakable solidity on the new base with which Christ supplies us, end quote. Now, this readiness to change, far from being a cause of spiritual discontinuity, is fully consistent with moral continuity. And Hildebrand, let me read another passage which testifies to that. He writes, I quote, "It must be emphasized that there is no contradiction between the Christian readiness to change and the principle of moral continuity. Our mental attitude reveals the trait of continuity insofar as we remain aware of the ultimate unity of all truth and all values in God. We must keep in view and continue to recognize whatever valid truth we have seized, whatever genuine value experienced. None of these must sink into oblivion once it is no longer actually present to our eyes. The man who is a prey to discontinuity accords an illegitimate priority to what happens to be present in his consciousness. He neglects more important and more valid impressions for the sake of present ones. He fails to preserve his contact with basic general truths and values beyond the range of mere present interest." End quote. It's on page 40 in the reader. You can check it later. Now, and the last point, so it's not, these are not only compatible, according to Hildebrand, these two attitudes. Even more, he in fact says that the continuity, which is another word for what he calls faithfulness in the art of living, is a condition of the transformation in Christ. And I would like to finish with this last quote. He writes, that's on the page 41 in the reader. He writes, "Without continuity, there could be no genuine responsiveness to the formative claim of Christ. For with each step achieved, the coinage received from Christ must be preserved and be made into a durable and inherent stamp on our nature. Only we must always remain changeable in the sense of remaining upon each level securely attained, susceptible of ascent towards yet higher levels along the path of transformation in Christ." End quote. So we see from these passages that faithfulness as the basic moral attitude is not only compatible with the readiness to change, but is rather a condition of it, according to von Hildebrand. And to put it somewhat paradoxically, we could say that in a sense, we must remain the same in order to be able to become someone else, that is, to be transformed in Christ. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. I will use this opportunity also to maybe clarify some notions from Hildebrand philosophy. I realize that in all the panels today, we use many terms which have meaning, like moral value, blindness, value response, etc., which those of you who are not so familiar with Hildebrand's philosophy maybe don't know what they mean. And his chapter on faithfulness in the art of living relies also, I would say maybe heavily in some instances, on some of these notions. So I will try to provide certain additional clarifications simply for you to be able to understand better this chapter when you will be reading it or if you already read it. And Martin also, I think, did a good job in distinguishing between basic moral stances and basic moral attitudes. So I will start with a note on Hildebrand's personality. As Martin said, he embodied probably all the things that he was writing about. And one of his important characteristics was that he was free from any influences of the spirit of the time, or from Zeitgeist, as Germans call it. I really like this word. You maybe also know the movie Zeitgeist. And he was one of those persevering men that he writes about, and he was free from this, as he calls it, tyranny of fashion. Yeah. So how could he be free from tyranny of passion? Precisely because he had a deep contact with reality. I think all of his students and people who write about him sense in his work this deep contact with reality and also reverence for truth. And this grounding in truth and in reality allows him to be free from tyranny of the passions. He also never allowed different peripheral considerations to take hold of him or take precedence over truth. And because of this, this had one very important repercussion in his life, and this is that he was able to endure suffering out of faithfulness to truth and to God. Some of you know that he was on a Nazi blacklist. He needed to emigrate from his country, from Germany, and then later also from Austria, because of his life was in danger from Nazis, and he was one of the biggest opponents of National Socialism, both in Germany while he lived there, and then when he moved to Austria in the 30s, he was a strong opponent of and critic of National Socialism. But this freedom from the spirit of the time didn't just allow himself to oppose National Socialism, but also to criticize many Catholics who became illusioned by National Socialism. We are maybe not, since this was many years ago, we're not maybe familiar with that at the time in Austria and Germany, many Catholics also believed that the church should build bridges with National Socialism. Some of them thought that this is such a strong movement, so it's an expression of the spirit of the time, and we cannot fight it, so we need to build bridges. Many of them also became illusioned by Hitler's speaking of positive Christianity. So he, on certain occasions, presented himself as friendly to the church. So many Catholics in Austria and in Germany became illusioned by that. Hildebrand wasn't, and then he wrote oftentimes in his articles to criticize these intentions of these Catholics. He was also a phenomenologist, as you know, and a very nuanced thinker. You will see in many readings in this seminar that when he wants to deal with some phenomenon, he often first speaks about the things that resemble that phenomenon but are in fact something else. In philosophical terms, we would say that he was clarifying different equivocations. So he would say, for example, faithfulness is not this, not this, not this, not this, or love resembles this, but it's not that. So he would say, for example, fidelity is opposed to mere bourgeois loyalty or pure clinging to habit. So he senses that some people will maybe identify faithfulness or other phenomena with something which resembles it, and then he goes on to clarify these nuances. And he often distinguishes these proper value responses, again, this term value response, I will also add some clarification later, from merely natural or psychological attitudes. So for him, value responses are never merely psychological or natural. Even though these psychological stances can have character of intentionality, they are never properly spiritual. And for Hildebrand, value responses are always properly spiritual, also faithfulness. So he would say, for example, the Christian love of neighbor is not the same as merely natural kindness or benevolence. So there are some people who are, by their temperament, kind, benevolent towards others, but this is not the same as Christian benevolence. Also, fidelity is not the result of some kind of lazy temperament or some psychological propensity of a person to stay what he or she knows. There are people who don't like to change, so they stick with what is secure and what they know, but this is not faithfulness in the full sense of the term, as Hildebrand explained. So I will give maybe some additional clarifications on the notion of superactuality, even though Martin and Mark already mentioned it, because this notion is very important to understand all these basic moral, fundamental moral attitudes that Hildebrand speaks about, including faithfulness. So you will see already on the second page of this chapter that he speaks about super-actual survival of our attitudes towards the world, towards fundamental truths and values, which remain unchanged even though our present attention is turned in a completely different direction. Hildebrand develops this notion of super-actuality in his writings on love, in his main book, which is called Natural of Love, where he says that love is a super-actual affective value response. And there he distinguishes between two meanings of superactuality. The first meaning refers to the fact that some stances persist through time until they are consciously changed or cancelled by the person who holds them. So they persist through time even though we are not consciously thinking about them. So, for example, I can hold that my brother is a reliable person. I don't think about it consciously every single moment, but this stance that I believe that my brother is reliable persists in me until I change or cancel this opinion. For example, if something would challenge that and I decide to change this belief. On the other hand, actual stances are those which only persist in moments in which we consciously experience them. For example, I pinch myself and then I feel the pain in certain moments, but when I stop consciously thinking to experience this doesn't exist anymore, yeah? So it's not superactual. So these impressions are merely actual. They mutually succeed each other in an endless stream, so there must be something deeper and more lasting to give us continuity and stability. And there comes into play the second meaning of superactuality, which refers to the fact that certain stances persist in a deeper sphere of the person, and so to speak, color all other experiences that one might have. For example, when I love someone, this stance lives in a deeper sphere of myself and colors all other stances and experiences. Or when I believe in God, it's not just that I hold a position that God exists, and then even when I'm not consciously thinking about it, this position is still there, but that faithfulness to God colors, informs, determines everything else that I experience or do. So, and this distinction in this second meaning of superactuality is not primarily between different stances or attitudes, but it refers to the importance one and the same thing can play in our lives. For example, a respect for a certain person might simply mean that this persists through time, so I hold respect for someone, but it can also have a deeper meaning that we, let's say, have a certain reverence, some deeper kind of respect for that person, and this is the second meaning of superactuality. So for Hildebrand, faithfulness is superactual not just in the first sense, meaning that it persists through time, but it also in the second sense, meaning that it needs to take hold of us in a deeper sphere and color everything else that we do. He also says that about joy and love. For example, I quote, "Joy caused by some happy event continues to live in the depth of our souls and colors everything which we do. Colors our tasks of the moment and colors our approach to all those things with which we are expressly concerned." Or also love for a beloved person remains living in the depth of our souls even though we are occupied by work, and it constitutes a sort of background against which we experience, which different events run their course. Now you will see that Hildebrand understands human person as having different levels of depth. And in this deepest level of depth, he recognizes two centers. Sometimes he speaks about three centers, but for simplicity, we can maybe say two. One he calls the humble, reverent, loving center, and the other is the center of truth, of pride and concupiscence. So not truth, definitely. And this first center, humble, reverent, loving center, is the foundation of all virtues, of all positive value responses. And the second center, the center of pride and concupiscence, is the root of all sins and vices of the person. And these centers are obviously antagonistic to each other, even though both of them can exist in one person. So probably in all of us, there are some responses which come from this loving, reverent center, and some actions which are a result of pride and concupiscence. When we speak of different levels of depth in a person, we can say that all people have this capacity. All people have the capacity for this depth, but they differ in a way in which they actualize this depth or life on a deeper level. Some people live merely on a more superficial level and are constantly taken over by momentary impressions. Hildebrand calls them butterflies. This is another characteristic of Hildebrand's philosophy that I really like, that he often, when he describes some phenomenon, he takes an ideal type, like he tells you what kind of person would embody this phenomenon. Or he mentions something, a character from literature or from music, and he says, okay, Beethoven's character is like that, or from another character from literature is the embodiment of this, what I'm speaking about. Or sometimes he gives his own names, like butterflies, or in another book, I think he speaks of metaphysical bohemians and things like that. So, but I think these ideal types are helpful to understand what he speaks about and connect it to our real lives. So, according to Hildebrand, only those who live in this deeper level of being can be said to have personality. Only in them can an inner spiritual plenitude be constituted. Only people who live in this deeper level of being are capable of a genuine value response. They are those persevering men that he speaks about, who hold on to truths and values and allow them to color everything else that they consciously experience. In them, the attitude towards values determines their impressions and not vice versa. So as we said, for Hildebrand, faithfulness is one of the value responses. And for Hildebrand, value is something important in itself, which doesn't derive its importance from any relation to us. So even if no one would recognize value, affirm it, or respond to it, a value would still stand above and beyond us in its objective importance. As such, values demand a certain response to us. There is an ought relation inherent to values. So as soon as we recognize a certain value, we recognize also this ought relation, that something should be, or our response should then also happen. And this also implies that there can be no instrumental relation to values. So we cannot approach values as means to another end. For example, we cannot be faithful to someone in order to get something from that person. Or we cannot be faithful to God to make him, let's say, do something for us or to gain some blessings for him. So this instrumental relation, when we approach faithfulness as means for something else, is contrary to a true value response. So faithfulness always needs to be a pure response to something or someone valuable in itself, be it another person or truth or God himself. So faithfulness is only due to objects possessing value, not to anything else. We don't have to be faithful to things that don't possess value. And Hildebrand eminently mentions three, let's say, objects, but in a qualified sense, that we can be faithful to. Other persons, truths and values, and God. For example, a true love to another person is essentially linked to faithfulness. As Hildebrand says beautifully, and I quote, "Faithfulness is so essentially one with love that everyone, at least as long as he loves, must consider his devotion an undying devotion. This holds good for every love, for parental and filial love, for friendship and for spousal love. The deeper a love, the more it is pervaded by fidelity." I would like to connect this to a saying by Karl Jaspers, which I never checked if it's really from his writings, but maybe Jaspers scholars can check that. But anyways, I think it really captures well what Hildebrand speaks about. And Jaspers says, fidelity is either absolute or it's nothing at all. So we cannot be faithful, but fidelity needs to be absolute. We said that there is an ought relation to value. So faithfulness is also a moral obligation in love towards a person or God and in relation to truth. We cannot just recognize that God exists or that we know some truth or that we love a person. As soon as we do that, the obligation to be faithful and to adhere to it emerges. Obviously, faithfulness needs to observe hierarchy of values. So when Hildebrand speaks about values, he conceives them in a hierarchical order. There are some higher and some lower values. So for example, if a person whom we love asks us to renounce God, we should not, for example, if you would be found in this situation, we should not do it because fidelity to God is the highest value. So we shouldn't be faithful in this regard to the person. We shouldn't do anything objectively immoral, even if the person whom we love demands that from us. Moral values are of the highest rank in the world of values. And to conclude, I would say, and Hildebrand hints that also in his text, is that faithfulness is most needed in times of tribulations. For example, when we have a psychological or natural temptation to be unfaithful to our spouse or a partner, this is when we need to delve deeper in our spiritual center and live from the world of values and not temporary impressions. Or, for example, if we would have the temptation to go against moral values to achieve some instrumental gain, for example, cheating on tax, or those of you who are students cheating on an exam. Maybe you have an opportunity to do that in some cases. And this is when faithfulness to moral values needs to predominate the more superficial and instrumental considerations. So this is when we need to delve deeper in our spiritual center in order to allow moral values to predominate. Or, for example, in politics, if considerations of popularity or being elected to an office would require us from us to denounce some moral values, we must not do it. Many of you know Professor Rocco Buttiglione, who is a great friend of the Hildebrand project, who was investigated before. He was nominated to become a European commissioner. That's like a minister in a European Commission. So he had investigation among the members of European Parliament who knew that he is a Christian politician and asked him all the time what's his stance on LGBT rights, on abortion, etc. And he was very skilled in, let's say, smartly responding to those questions. But at a certain point, he simply said he was brought to the situation where he needs to, let's say, explicitly say his stance, and he said it, and he lost the office. So he gave the primacy to moral values. Even though he's a very, let's say, smart politician, he himself says that a good politician should never allow himself or bring himself to the situation in which he should choose between power and reverence for God or faithfulness to God. So a skilled politician shouldn't bring himself to the situation where he should lose power, because power is something also that politicians strive for. In any case, he obviously gave priority to faithfulness to God and to moral values. For a final discussion, I will not answer this question now, but just a short note. I don't know if you have watched the movie Silence about Jesuits in Japan, in which one Jesuit is asked to renounce God so that he would save a group of Christians who are there on the cross. I think they're crucified, they're suffering, and then the torturers tell him, if you renounce God, they will be saved, so we will not torture them and kill them. And he renounces God. So maybe a moral dilemma, if you want to discuss it afterwards. Was he justified in doing that, or he wasn't? Thank you very much.
Well, after these very thoughtful and comprehensive remarks from my fellow panelists, I hope you won't mind if I take us on a bit of a temporary detour. What I'd like to do in my comments is talk about faithfulness in Hildebrand, but do so by means of noting a few points of contact between Hildebrand and the 19th century American philosopher William James. And in passing, I will offer you a mini primer, so to speak, on the meanings of pragmatism in William James. And I'll wrap this up by suggesting or opening up a question or an area about the relation of the moral life and the intellectual life. So to begin, faithfulness, constancy, continuity, these are roughly equivalent terms as Hildebrand uses them. And right off the bat, thing that strikes me about it is that it's a temporal thing. And it has to do with our temporal nature as human beings and our finite nature as human beings. It's the attitude of holding firmly to those truths and values that one has already discovered. So it's past, present, future kind of a thing. And this thing, faithfulness, is so important because of a fact about our human condition. Namely that, and I'm quoting Hildebrand here, our attention cannot long remain focused on any one object with the same intensity. A movement from one to another is proper to our thought, as well as to our feeling and will. This is a very nice sentence here. It touches on the intellect, or affectivity, and will, which is important for Hildebrand, of course. But here I'll note that what Hildebrand says largely resembles something in James's observations about human consciousness. In his 1890 work, The Principles of Psychology, he coins the well-known term, the stream of consciousness, which I'm sure everybody's heard, right? This thing which is personal, ever-changing, sensibly continuous, appearing to deal with objects independent of itself, and also selectively attentive or interested in particular features of the things it regards. In any case, for Hildebrand, the upshot of faithfulness or constancy is this, and again I'm quoting, while we proceed to another impression and give our mental attention to another mental object, again, moving through time, right? The preceding impression or object does not vanish, but will, according to its significance, be retained on a deeper level. So this is how or why we are not flighty or like butterflies living in the moment, but rather persons who retain some residue or impression, or whatever you want to call it, of the important values we encounter. There's something similar in James. For James, conscious thought is, a stream, it's something moving in flux, it's changing over time. And this is not to say that our individual thoughts do not have temporal duration, they don't last for a time, but rather more deeply and interestingly, James writes that no state once gone can recur and be identical with what it was before. I mean, he appeals to this idea that each experience has an effect on our brains and our wiring in that sense, and so it modifies the brain, and then when we have what we think to be the same or a similar experience in the future, it's not happening in the original unmodified brain. So there's no repeating the past. So this is sort of Heraclitean cannot step in the same river twice kind of idea. So in a different way, James is also suggesting or open to, I think, this idea of a residue retained that sort of we keep. There's a permanence to it. It's affecting us going forward. Back to Hildebrand, though. Hildebrand makes the point that, like helpful beacons, we might call them, values are always out there for us to grasp. But if we lack faithfulness or constancy, given the fact of our finitude, we will at some point certainly turn away and lose sight of those things. By contrast, if we do have faithfulness, constancy, the light of values will shine, even in the humdrum situations of workaday life, yes, even at the moments of temptation. Quoting again. So this brings us to a really important point, which is that faithfulness, constancy, continuity, the preserving of our grasp of values is the key to our progress. It ensures that we have a true north, that we're properly oriented. Without faithful attentiveness to values, even if I recognize my faults and make good resolutions to change, I will give too much weight to every fleeting impression and be unable to retain what I have acquired. So we fall into forgetfulness and backsliding. It's inevitable. So at this point, I want to digress for a bit, a little more discreetly, into James's 1907 book, Pragmatism. In it, there are... he offers us sort of a fleshing out of this idea of pragmatism, but what we find there is that there are several analogical meanings or usages of the term. Right now, I'm going to develop in a very compressed, too compressed, really, way, three of those usages or meanings. One, pragmatism as a temperament. Two, pragmatism as a method, a philosophical method of settling disputes. And 3, pragmatism is a theory of truth. And we kind of have to move in that progression because you have to understand the first in order to understand the second, in order to understand the third. So beginning with the first, pragmatism as a temperament. What we're talking about here is something, sort of a native disposition that does two things. It affirms the value of the empirical data of our experience, the importance of observable facts, sort of the scientific mindset, right? And moreover, it decries any sort of vicious intellectualism that sort of flies off into the abstract realm, okay, away from concrete experience. So that's on the one hand. But also, the pragmatist temperament insists that the universe is a place where things like values, ideals, God, free will, these things make sense, even though they're not, strictly speaking, observable in an empirical way or measurable way. And importantly, these unseen realities, metaphysical realities, make sense not as mere abstractions, but always only within the context of the world as we experience it. Moreover, the person, the honest pragmatist, the one who has this temperament, is attuned to the experiential significance of these unseen metaphysical realities. That is, this person will recognize that unobservable entities, such as the ones I mentioned, can and do have meanings that are borne out in and justified through our concrete experience. Okay, so that's the temperament. Second, pragmatism as a method. This method seeks to resolve philosophical disputes or questions in one of two ways. Either by attempting to identify a specific answer or resolution grounded in or justifiable given our practical experience, our actual lives, or by calling off the debate entirely. It's not worth talking about. In either case, it's the practical import, significance, the upshot of the question and its answer, the concrete impact on life and experience, or lack thereof, that's determinative for the method. So James, in his writings, applies this method to several issues, including the understanding of God, the question of design in nature, the free will versus determinism debate, the problem of the one and the many, among other things. And all of these treatments, I would argue, effectively rebut any claim that James's version of pragmatism neglects or dismisses out of hand important metaphysical issues. James himself writes, so far from keeping her eyes on the immediate practical foreground, as she is accused of doing, pragmatism dwells just as much upon the world's remotest perspectives. And yet, okay, that was the end of the quote. And yet, it also insists that these things, like God and free will and so on and so forth, if they are real, they must make some real difference in the world. For it is precisely this real difference that will make it possible for us to know these things. And so it is precisely this real difference that pragmatism seeks to track, to get hold of. So third, now to the theory of truth. This theory of truth, the pragmatist theory of truth, emerges from the pragmatist method that I just described. And so it works this way. It's real simple. We begin by asking a question, simple question. What difference does truth make in anyone's life? What is truth known as concretely in our experience? In answering that question, James began by noting that truth is something that we say about our beliefs, our ideas, our thoughts. Okay? and specifically about the ones that we attach to reality, what is. Okay? And these ideas or belief, we could call them the substrate of truth. Okay, these are things to which we apply this name truth. Truth expresses, moreover, some relation between our thought and the world. Fine. To this point, in this regard, I think it's fair to say that James lines up with the traditional correspondence theory of truth. And yet, James explicitly takes issue with the correspondence theory of truth. Though such a theory of truth is not necessarily incorrect, according to James, it's just too abstract. He's amenable to the definition, this idea, namely that truth in some way indicates an agreement between thought and reality, but he finds such a formulation rather, shall we say, simplistic and vague and imprecise. So as a pragmatist, one needs to push further and ask what it actually means in our concrete, practical lives, in experience, what it means for thought and reality to agree. And here James says this: true ideas are those that we can assimilate, validate, corroborate, and verify. False ideas are those that we cannot. End of the quote. So the activities, the actual concrete experiences, these activities of assimilation, validation, corroboration, verification, these are central to the pragmatist notion of truth. But still, James moves to an even more, shall we say, novel position by asserting that it's these activities that are the very essence of truth. And James is stating his claim in this way: truth is made. Okay, it's something that happens in and through and with the knower. Okay, and when we place the emphasis on the knower, we can then draw out these two special characteristic marks of truth, which are verification, or in many cases merely verifiability, that can eventually be verification, and satisfaction. Truth is this word that we apply to all those ideas that can be verified in concrete experience and that are also, in some manner or another, satisfying to the knower. And we need to be kind of precise when we're talking about this word satisfying. Satisfying in the sense of facilitating one's successful, not frustrated, navigation in the world through one's life. Okay. What is true, those ideas that are true, are the ones that make me a better player in the game of life. Okay. And note that our delusions don't do this. So it's not any and all ideas that are real candidates for truth here, even if we like these things, like to think these things, right? They can't be delusional ideas, right? So it's at this point that where I want to suggest that there's something in play in James that's akin to Hildebrand's faithfulness. Okay? James also emphasizes in his fleshing out of this idea of truth that as new truths are made or arrived at, this process, right? They're formed in a progressive way. They're cumulative things. They accrue, you might say, kind of like sediment. They build up. Truths are well-formed only in accordance with the constraints of empirical reality, and truths themselves, once formed, serve to limit or constrain any further formulations of truth. So pragmatism is not this sort of freewheeling kind of thing. It's very much a constrained making of a process whereby truths accrue or are made. In the process of arriving at further truths, the knower is necessarily checked, limited, constrained, not just by objective empirical reality, but also by the mental order of ideas that has been built up on the basis of all prior experience. Any new true idea or belief must derange common sense and previous belief as little as possible. So any given individual, you or me, any of us, has little room for maneuver in the formulation of new truths. Now, to use the language of correspondence, pragmatist truths must generally agree with all three sorts of realities: empirical observations, conceptual and logical relations, and all previously established or vetted truths that we've arrived at. And James would argue, I don't know if you would agree, that this is a far more descriptive, perhaps helpful account of agreement than what is otherwise rather imprecisely suggested by a traditional correspondence theory. All right, so I'm going to conclude now with the suggestion that when James talks about these constraints imposed by empirical observations, conceptual and logical relations, and previously vetted truths, something in this picture very, very much resembles faithfulness. Read a quote from Hildebrand here. Continuity is a condition, not only for stable orientation, but also for intellectual progress itself. It is on the basis of continuity that we are able to preserve established truths and at the same time to supplement them with new ones, both in the sense of an extension of the breadth of knowledge and of a reinterpretation of old truths in the light of insights newly acquired. That's from the Transformation in Christ, Transformation in Christ, page 18. And of course, when we're talking about faithfulness in the context of the art of living, we're really more explicitly dealing with faithfulness and its role and significance in the moral life. But what I want to dwell on for a moment, and I'm not going to resolve anything here, I just sort of lay it out there, is that this one and the same thing, faithfulness, has a role and deep significance both in both realms, in the intellectual life and in the moral life. And I just want to offer for your further consideration on your own at another time and another place. Think about those two things together and what may be some deeper significance there. So, thanks.
Well, thank you to all of our speakers. We'll take about 25 minutes for questions. So is there a microphone to pass around back there? And raise your hand if you have a question. We've got one in the middle here, a couple up here.
In the reader, the Hildebrand reader, it seems that in regards to contemplation and recollection, there's some connection to faithfulness as a fundamental moral attitude. In this call that von Hildebrand has to constantly maintain a certain consciousness towards God. Are these connected in von Hildebrand's mind? Or is the panel able to comment on one's capacity to maintain this consciousness and if it does have any relationship to faithfulness as he understands it?
Well, I think Hildebrand is very descriptive in many parts of his work. So, also in several occasions, he speaks about the recollected man. He also mentions him as a kind of an ideal type. And this recollected man is the one who lives in this deeper level of being and also is fully conscious, not just of himself, but also of the world of values and of God. So, if we say that faithfulness is a response to value and to God, and then make another step saying that to respond to values, we first need to know them or cognize them, which he develops further in other books. Then also this kind of recollection is obviously needed for the constant cognizance of values, so that we would be, let's say, more or less constantly in the presence of values or in the presence of God. So I would say, I'm not sure if he explicitly draws this connection as you asked, but I think they can be drawn, and you recognize it well in this sense, as I just mentioned. Yeah.
Father James?
Thank you for your talk, all three of you. My question is going to be based on Elizabeth's presentation, but really it's for all three of you. I really was very happy with the way you laid out pragmatism as an attitude, as a philosophical method, and then as a theory of truth. I couldn't help but think about the state of Catholic spirituality, and you could say pragmatic tendencies within it, certainly in our culture, specifically in the second sense, a kind of a methodological pragmatism. It seems that many Catholics really have a hard time dealing with or taking up questions about God just for the sake of God, but they're happy to talk about spiritual practices, methods, techniques that they think will advance them in some way in the spiritual life, because they have some cash value or payback in terms of what they're going to get out of the spiritual practice. And there's two sort of, I think, tests. There's two tests or two signs that someone is maybe given to a pragmatic methodology in their spiritual life. And the two tests would be number one, can you see the value of monasticism? Like pure monasticism, where there's no active apostolate. It seems the only real justification for pure monasticism would be fidelity to God. Just because God is God, and there's really no other reason. I know that people like to say, well, yeah, but they pray for the world, they intercede for but that's never been the justification for monasticism. Monks need to do that, and cloistered nuns need to do that, but they're really just witnesses to the value of God. Just God being God. And even whatever witness value they have is not the justification for it, because someone could go become a solitary hermit, not bear much witness, but it would still be a case of fidelity to God, a super actual response to God, a super actual response of fidelity that colored everything. But there's another test for whether one's spirituality is maybe pragmatic. And that is, can you see the value of going to Mass without receiving Holy Communion? And a lot of Catholics just cannot see the value of going to Mass without receiving Holy Communion. You have to be able to see it's just the sacrifice of Christ. The love in the sacrifice is just so good, so valuable, that it's worth just being there and participating in it with the appropriate responses of thanksgiving and adoration, etc., that's an act of fidelity. And actually, you might be better off not receiving Holy Communion, depending on the dispositions of your soul. But does it strike you, I guess this is for all of you, that this category of pragmatism helps us to unpack a sort of maybe difficulties or challenges in our contemporary situations as Catholics in thinking about the spiritual life?
Thanks for the question. It's helpful for thinking. I might be hopeful that, you're talking about certain clear distortions of what's good, right? In terms of people's perception of value and so on. I might be hopeful, let me get back to you, but I might be hopeful that if you had a person whose value perceptions were well ordered, whose attentiveness and to value were basically right, and that we could get there, right? And it would still be pragmatist in a way, right? It wouldn't be the crass cash value, what's in it for me kind of pragmatism, but just responding to the important in itself as value in itself, right? So I don't know. I just sort of want to take I guess what's implicit as a premise in your question and turn it a little bit.
Yeah, I would maybe offer more like a down-to-earth or life example, not so much philosophical one. I think my impression is that our culture today, or the zeitgeist, is imbued with this pragmatism. Or we don't necessarily need to call it pragmatism in any kind of, as some kind of developed philosophical theory, but more like instrumental relation to the world. Yeah. So I think the dominant culture, apart from the, let's say, philosophical and theological faculties in the academia, approaches everything, including truth, in an instrumental way. I'm also sometimes struggling with that with myself when I'm like teaching on something very philosophical. So I'm wondering whether these young people are at all interested in that, like, or they would like, or should I add to the end of my presentation some kind of practical implications for life? You know, how does this relate to your real life? And it's not just in the world of ideas. When you're speaking about monasticism, I think that the dominant, even though you say it's not a, let's say, a right justification, but I think the dominant justification that I hear is that monks pray for us, or like they lead a spiritual fight for us who are in the, let's say, practical world, for the layman, for apostolate and everything else. So this is like, then it becomes clear to let's say, a general believer, okay, it makes sense because they do something practical, even though spiritual, you know, they pray, so they fight for us. So I think also in the church, I'm also struggling with what you said when you mentioned this last thing, a mass without communion. I have a problem with myself with that. I'm also struggling, should I go, like, if I want to receive communion? So I think it's very deeply in all of us, because obviously we are influenced by the culture. And then obviously the philosophers, well, they like to discuss theoretical things, so they don't necessarily, at least in what they are interested in, necessarily are fully like taken over by pragmatism, but in many other domains we are. And I would say another area of life which suffers from this is leisure. You know, Joseph Pieper's little book on leisure. So leisure is purely non-pragmatic. It's completely like being, let's say, like that. And then also he speaks about, so someone can have an instrumental, well, the dominant culture at least has an instrumental relation to leisure. They say, like, you should have some rest so that you are able to work later, or that you can function later, yeah? So read some book or go to the sea and rest and watch the nature, and then you will recover, and then you can again be productive member of the society. So again, instrumentalization of leisure. Yeah.
So I'm gonna cheat, and before I ask my question, say one thing about this question, which is I think there's a subtle equivocation on pragmatism or pragmatic that's going on here. That on the one sense, there's a negative sense of pragmatism, which is almost equivalent to utilitarian, that I'm simply using something, I'm instrumentalizing something to get some cash value out of it, that kind of a thing. But I take James to be saying something, this principle that Elizabeth mentioned, if it's real, it makes some difference to my lived experience. And in that sense, pure monasticism is very pragmatic. It makes a huge difference to the way you live your life, not cashing out in terms of your bank account, maybe, or, you know, to get some further thing out of it. So I kind of think there might be a little bit of a shift there. It looks like Elizabeth has.
Instrumentalization is associated with pragmatism in some sense, but it is an equivocation here. For James, it's fleeing from distinctions without differences is what it is. We need to always look to experience to understand these terms that we're using. So yeah, thank you, Dan.
So just to clarify, I think I made a qualification in the beginning of my answer. I'm not speaking about the philosophical theory of pragmatism in James or anyone else. I'm just speaking of a, let's say, practical attitude in the world, which we can call in different names. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, just simply wanted to flag the different sort of senses there. Okay, so my question is mainly directed at Martin, but again, really for the whole panel. And I want to ask about this sense in which faithfulness is a kind of precondition for many of the other value responses or the whole life of transformation in Christ. Because if I have a moment of rightly apprehending a powerful value, and maybe it does, I'm convicted and I summon a will to change. If I can't hold on to that, then it's going to peter out pretty quickly. And this question is a little bit confessional because this is something that, for myself, that I struggle with greatly. Seeing a real value, and you go strong for a little while, and then it tapers off. And I think many of us can relate. In some ways, reverence is like this. It's a kind of precondition. If you don't have that reverence towards being, for reality to open up to you, you're going to have a hard time having any value response in the first place. But here's my question. I kind of know what to do if I realize that I'm insufficiently reverent. In the moment there, I can make certain decisions to say, oh, so I need to return again to the given, and I need to attend more deeply. But I'm not quite sure what to do if I realize that I'm bad at faithfulness, because it seems like to form any resolution to practice faithfulness, I have to already have some faithfulness to go on, right? So it seems like there's a catch-22 here, and I'm hoping one of you can help me get out of that.
Yes, thank you. Well, I'll try to give some kind of ideas I have to that, but I would also then come back shortly to the point before. There might be temperamental differences between people, that some people are really more attached to what is present, what is at the moment, and for them it might be more difficult to have this kind of attitude. But since Hildebrand says this is a moral attitude, so it's really freely taken, so the temperament might make it more difficult or less difficult for you, but in either case, it's really a freely taken stance. So for someone, it might be easier to reach solidity on that level. For someone, it might be more difficult. Like Aristotle says, for someone to reach courage is more. If you are naturally fearful, it's more difficult for you to become courageous. Or it's a different path for me to become courageous than if I am overly reacting temperamentally to situations. So even here, I think, so temperament plays a role, but since it is a freely taken stance, every human person under certain conditions, maybe cultural and educational, should be able to make that decision and develop that disposition. But of course, it would be different for different people. So, but I think the only way you say for someone it might be more difficult. Okay, that's true, but everyone should strive for it. And for someone it will be easier than some other attitudes, and for someone it might be less difficult. But we have, I think, according to von Hildebrand, we are called to all moral values, and we are also called to all those fundamental moral attitudes, and they strengthen each other also. So it might be. As you develop the other virtues, that might help you also to make stronger this one. And coming to this your question of pragmatism, I think it's difficult to put together von Hildebrand and James because they really live in very different worlds philosophically, although in general it's being said that phenomenology and pragmatism, that there are overlaps. To some extent there are some common themes, but still they are different. But I'm thinking about the relation more in terms of Hildebrand. Often when he uses the term pragmatic, it's the negative one, like he speaks in the What is Philosophy, that we should get free from this pragmatic attitude to reality, because that narrows down the attention just to those aspects of reality which are pragmatically relevant. And so for him to be able to grasp essences and that what's necessary, essentially necessary, you need to have some kind of freedom from this pragmatic attitude. But also, I think that would be the general tenor in von Hildebrand. But I think he has also an interesting ideas about utility. It's in the 4th chapter of the Ethics, but there's also text in the Nachlass on utile, and I think what I'm going to say is probably in the second one, but I'm not sure. But there he also has a positive notion of utility, not this utilitarian, and this is the notion that useful in the deepest sense is that which helps me to attain eternal life. And so maybe if some of those things that James says go beyond a mere practical utility, and they certainly do, they might be approaching that dimension of utility, this deeper sense of utility, which also Hildebrand recognizes in this passage. But it's certainly not like that. Mostly when he speaks of pragmatism, it's rather the negative aspect.
Just a short reflection, Dan, on your question. I think answering your own question in your book on excellence would be great. But I think answering it is much easier within the framework of Aristotelian understanding of habit. So basically, we would say, like, you practice, 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 and then you become faithful, or any other virtue.
But you see, there's a trick that's different from all the others, because I can build any other habit under the sun if I have the virtue of sticking to new habit formation. But if I lack the virtue of being able to stick to a habit, then how do I ever get that habit of...
Well, it's the same problem in Aristotle, too. It's sort of the same problem in Aristotle. You need the model, you need the phronimos, you need the teacher outside of yourself as a guide, right? So it's something like that, practices of spiritual direction or whatever, right?
Yeah, but my point would be that with Hildebrand, it's harder. Because for him, habit is not just a result of repetition. It's like superactual stance. So I think here, the answer in a Hildebrandian sense would be something along the lines, go deeper in yourself to reach the spiritual center, which I don't think that necessarily excludes any kind of, let's say, self-education or practice and things like that.
All right, I think we have time for one more question.
Hello, I was wondering, so if I'm not mistaken, in his chapter on the heart and the art of living, he calls love an effective response. And given how love and fidelity are tied here, such that love necessitates at least the intention of fidelity, and it seems as though in the effective sphere of love, it's hard for one to expect that they will always have an effective response. And it seems like fidelity is supposed to, at least kind of how we see it, it's supposed to make up for that. But do you think that fidelity requires some kind of consistent, effective response in the sphere of love, or not really?
It's a tough question. Yeah. Well, certainly there is, according to Hildebrand, your fidelity. I mean, love is an affective value response, but you are still free to. You are free towards even that affective response. That's the point has been already mentioned of this disavowing or sanctioning that Hildebrand is convinced that you can do that with effective responses. You can say your spiritual free yes to an effective response, and you can say no, like malicious joy. You better say no, even if you feel it. You will feel it at a moment, but you can still say, it's not a good thing now to be so happy about the neighbor who just crashed his car because I don't like him. So you can find an inner, but toward the positive attitudes, you can be affectuated to someone, but then you have to also make a decision, a judgment whether this is the right thing to do, and if you think it's the right thing to do, you can sanction that attitude, and then it's not only effective, it's also a free attitude, according to von Hildebrand. And so that's one thing. But then, of course, fidelity in terms of like in marriage, that's another aspect there, because it's a promise also, and so there is a duty to fulfill the promise, and so there's a fidelity also to this vow which you are making. It's not just a fidelity to your feelings. And so this is another, so to say, element. And you're right. You can. There could be a situation where the affective response ceases. I mean, no one wishes to be in that situation, but that happens sometimes. But if you are married and you have promised that this fidelity, then you are bound by that still. So, that's, but there's much more to say.
Maybe I can just add, affectivity for Hildebrand, in this sense, is a spiritual affectivity. It doesn't mean having butterflies in your stomach the whole time. So he's not saying that, like, when you respond effectively to the beloved person, that you will be, let's say, in love the whole time or feel some kind of psychologically positive feelings. So for him, affective value response in this sense is spiritual. If you compare, like, there is a response to theoretical responses. 2 + 2 = 4. So that's something true. So we assent to that, respond to that, we affirm that, but it's somehow dry. And then when he says other responses are effective, it means that they have some overflow, something more than when we affirm that 2 + 2 = 4. So if you would compare these two experiences, you would understand the difference. But then this affective response doesn't necessarily mean that on, let's say, level of psychological level of impressions or psychic feelings or bodily feelings, that you will all the time have whatever positive emotions, yeah? So that's not expected from the affective value response.
All right, let's thank our speakers.